All right, welcome. Great to see everybody. Over the last 4 years, I've been hanging out pretty much on a weekly basis, sometimes daily, but always weekly. I've been hanging out with addicts of every type and alcoholics. It's my new club that I hang out with. And most of you know that about 7 years ago, I had been dealing with 3 decades of insomnia. I go to a psychiatrist, finally trying to deal with my sleep problem. They try me on a bunch of different sleep stuff, but the thing that worked like a magic pill was Xanax. And I thought I'd found the answer to all of life's problems. And I'd take a Xanax pill before I went to bed. I'd sleep for 7 hours, first time in like 30 years. It was awesome. After about 9 months of Xanax every night, it started rapidly declining. My psychiatrist was an old school where he just kind of doled it out. Those aren't around too much anymore. Shouldn't be, by the way. But anyway, this one was. So I just, okay, well, I'll just take more. And then that didn't work. And then I started throwing alcohol in. And so for about 2.5 years every night, I was doing Xanax and alcohol. Got addicted, and then my life kind of unraveled and went into a tailspin, and that got published broadly, like all over Kansas City and around the world, through news feeds, religious news feeds, Charisma Today, Christianity Today, all kinds of stuff. And I wanted to die and was filled with shame, and finally, about 4 years ago, thought, God, I got to get my act together, and I went to a 12-step group and just started hanging out with addicts and alcoholics and started sort of trying to heal and find my way back to a place of sobriety and really to try to figure out what my life would be in the future. And so it's been an interesting journey. I've grown to love the recovery community, and I decided when I came out and started talking about all this stuff about 2.5 years ago that I would just do it publicly because my failures had been broadcast publicly, right? So what other option do I have? And I just thought, okay, well, if people want to journey through this with me, I'm going to be brutally honest publicly and very vulnerable publicly with everybody. Now, the beautiful thing about that is that when I meet with people one-on-one, because I've been so public in my failures, people are very, very willing to almost instantly share with me their deepest failures. You think, well, how is that a gift, Fred? Well, vulnerability is really, really powerful. And even when we open up about our deepest shame, our deepest failures, there's something about the human spirit when we connect in our weakness that there's a spiritual activity that goes on around vulnerability. And it actually helps us in the healing process. I was meeting somebody down at Messenger Coffee Shop down at 16th and Grand. And after I was done, I was doing a little work, and there was a young woman who came up to me and had written out a little card and handed it to me. And I kind of recognized her, and I had free time, and when I read it, I was going, oh my gosh, if you got a minute, let's sit down and talk. And so we ended up talking for probably an hour, okay? And this was a young woman who went to my church previously, so she recognized me and knew me. I was her pastor for a while. And she began to share with me her journey of food addiction. She was a model, a really beautiful young woman, and as it turned out, she had grown up kind of like a latchkey kid. Her parents were working all the time, and some crazy people in her neighborhood, some men kind of started grooming her for some sexual exploitation issues. And so she ended up getting abused sexually at a very young age, early teen years. And then as she moved into her adulthood, she developed issues with with anorexia and bulimia. She was super fit, beautiful, but she would binge eat. So, like, she would just eat, and then purge. So she didn't weigh much at all. And what ended up happening over time was she ended up going to places like grocery stores and Target and different places like that. She would walk through the aisles, the grocery store aisles, and just eat stuff off the shelf and then pack a bunch of stuff with her, steal it. Now, by the way, she was from a very wealthy family. It wasn't a matter of not being able to afford it, okay? She would pack herself up with food, and she'd go out, and then she'd eat more, and then she'd purge. And this became a cycle for her. She ended up getting caught stealing. She had a rap sheet as a 20-something and had an incredibly hard time dealing with this addiction, this food addiction. And so my public sharing about my wrestling with Xanax and alcohol opened up a conversation with her, and it ultimately led to her getting connected to some places that helped her out, and she is now on a journey of recovery and healing herself, lives down in South Carolina now. But addiction is an issue that plagues our culture. Would you agree with that? I've come to realize that I have an addictive personality. It just means that when I get into something, I usually go full bore. And I don't always have the proper balance or boundaries when I go full bore. And that could be like cycling hundreds of miles or rock climbing or studying and reading or you name it. And of course, when I got into Xanax and alcohol, I did that full bore too. And so there are issues around addiction in our culture that I think really sometimes affect all of us in certain ways. There's a lot of different kinds of addictions. As I reflect on this, I'm starting a new series called Prophetic Imagination. Prophetic Imagination. And if you were to read all of the prophets, the big ones, we call them, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, the ones that have big books in the Hebrew Bible. Then you've got those small prophets that have the little books, And so, these are major prophets and minor prophets based on the size of the books that are in the Hebrew Bible, okay? But if you were to summarize, what was the message of the prophets? And of course, they covered so much territory. And all the prophets were Torah teachers, by the way. If you summarized it, there were really two big issues that they tackled over and over and over again. One was idolatry, and the other was injustice. Idolatry and injustice. And so over these next few weeks, we're going to be looking at this prophetic imagination. And the first couple of weeks here, I'm going to deal with idolatry, and then the next couple of weeks, I'm going to deal with injustice from the imagination of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, okay? Now, idolatry, I want to read just a couple of passages real quick. First of all, one that you'll all know, Exodus 20. It's one of the references to the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20, verse 1, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. By the way, I'm going to suggest to you that idolatry and addiction are closely aligned with each other, and that slavery kind of can come along with it, with addiction, okay? And then it says, you must not have any other God but me, and you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. And you must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. Now, what's interesting is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, when this passage was actually penned, most of the world would have been polytheistic. They would have worshiped a plethora of gods. And you can go back and actually read about all of these ancient gods. The ancient Near Eastern gods of Sumeria, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, it's all on record, and you can read about the stories of the gods. When you get into the Greco-Roman period, you remember the Greek gods, and you can read all about those in the Greek mythology. And then many of the Roman gods were the Greek gods. They just renamed them in Latin. Same stories, same people. And what's interesting is that most of the gods, when you read about the gods of the polytheistic world, most of them were relatively like us, pretty crazy. If you've ever, those of you who are old enough, you remember the Jerry Springer show, and he would have all these beautifully dysfunctional people on there, and he would entertain America with American dysfunctionalism in relationships and family life. Well, honestly, if you read the gods of the ancient world, it's kind of like that. There's just tons of dysfunction. And, I mean, they murder each other, they have sex with each other, they have babies with each other, the babies become gods, and all these kind of things. But on the flip side, there's some gods in those pantheon of gods that are actually really amazing, heroic type figures. And there's all kinds of lessons in all of that mythology, good and evil, and how to navigate the world. So there's lessons that come out of this stuff. So these creation of the gods and the stories of the gods many times taught morals as well. So it's a fascinating kind of world. But the Jewish people came up with this idea, there's not like thousands of gods. What was their brilliant idea? There's like one God. And this one God, the Hebrew people would argue, is loving and just. If we were to put a couple of characteristics around this Hebrew idea of God, loving and just. Okay? Now, if you've read the Hebrew Bible, you know that sometimes you're wondering about that. Like, is he really just? Is he really loving? All that kind of stuff, right? But even my Hebrew friends and rabbi friends today would argue that if we read this ancient book correctly, then God is loving and God is just. And so there's this idea of monotheism. Now, when we think about addiction, I think that anything that takes us away from connection to God, connection to self, and connection to others. Let's say it even this way: loving connection to God, loving connection to self, and loving connection to others can many times lead us into addictive patterns. And by the way, the stuff that you make an idol out of is good stuff, right? Just material, it's just stuff, it's just wood or bronze or iron. I mean, it's a good gift, right? Most of the things that become addictive to us are good. We just misuse them. So a lot of addiction is about taking good gifts, and then we run to these good gifts to supply more than that good gift can deliver, and then we develop patterns of behavior or substance abuse around that particular good gift, and then it becomes actually a curse. A little wine's a good gift, right? Wine every day, all night long, bottles and bottles and bottles, not so good. Can I hear something? All right. Because it gets real quiet when I talk about addiction. I'm like going, God, I'm the only one. I'm alone in this. I'm just being vulnerable again. And there goes Fred down the vulnerability path. And Brene Brown, how many of you are familiar with Brene? You need to read her stuff, listen to her stuff. Brilliant sociologist who made her name studying shame and the healing component to shame, vulnerability, okay? And in her study, she says that this particular group of people who are alive in America right now, if we trace all of American history back to its beginning, this group of Americans is the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated cohort of people in American history. Right now, those of us who are living today, we live amongst all of this wealth, right? All of the nation who is the wealthiest nation in the world has led us to be a people who are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated group of Americans in American history. Huh. So, you mean wealth and money don't always meet our deepest needs? And we want other things to make us feel better fast, other than our status and wealth and all of that? So we are an addicted nation. An addicted nation. And as I think about addiction, it crosses really quickly into idolatry for me. If you study the ancient places where the polytheistic gods were worshipped, like if you went to a temple and worshiped one of those gods, or plurality of those gods, what's interesting is that in these places of worship, particularly like the fertility cults, like basically if you went to a fertility cult, you could have sex with a fertility prostitute. Any type of sex you would desire, you would have sex with that person. This was like pornography for the gods. And it would sexually arouse the gods. They would have sex. Their sex then rained down blessing on the land, the fertility of the land, and then that produced fertility of your crops. So the goal with having sex with the prostitute at the temple is to get your crops to grow. Well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, by the way, if you have an addiction, then whatever occasion that happens in your life, your addiction is a perfect solvent to that problem, right? So if you're happy, oh, it's time to drink. Or if you're sad, oh, it's time to drink. Or you're getting ready to go on a video, oh, it's time to kick it off with it. Whatever your addiction is, it solves all your problems. You go to it because it solves all your problems, right? So it makes perfect sense, right? That you go to the temple prostitutes to solve all your problems. And there's also ritual drugs that could be involved in that temple prostitution. As we study archaeology now, there could be ancient drugs available, ancient alcohol, sex, drugs, maybe a little rock and roll, who knows? Which all are, by the way, can all be what? None of those things in them themselves are evil. They can be good gifts, right? But good things and good gifts used the wrong way can turn into idols that actually enslave us and really tear our lives apart. One of, I think, the idols that's very common in America is the idolatry around the concept of God. And one of the things I love about the 12-step world is that people who have experienced like a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God who's out to get you, and there'll be people who come into the 12-step world who don't want anything to do with church because they've had a legalistic God who hates them and is going to get them and all this kind of stuff. Then they're just like, well, I don't want anything to do with God because the God they got raised with is an abusive, crazy God. And so what happens is you say, well, you just kind of work with your own concept of God. But what we say is that your concept of God needs to be something that's loving and caring and greater than you. And I think at the heart of what the Hebrew mind envisioned of God was a God who's loving and who's just and who's caring at its best. God who's loving, who's just, and who's caring. So I think sometimes we can have a concept of God that is idolatrous. It misses the mark. I think sometimes we can have a God that we go to make ourselves feel better. Most of us, when we feel pain, it could be emotional pain, physical pain, relational pain, we want to just feel better fast. We don't want to deal with that pain. We want to numb out. And so we run to an addiction to numb out. And addictions can be substance. They can be things like food, drugs, alcohol, things we consume. But addictions can also be behavioral. It can be sex. It could be gambling. It could be gaming. It could be your phone and the internet. It could be shopping. It could be fishing. I mean, as good as fishing. Like, fishing's good for you, right? But, if you get addicted to fishing and all you do is fish and you neglect yourself and you neglect your family and you neglect, these other things, then even a good thing can become highly toxic to a healthy life that's connected to God, others, and self in a loving way. There's lots of different ways. The most successful program in the world for recovering from addictions of all kind, either substance or behavioral, is the 12-step model. And what's fascinating to me is the first 3 steps of the 12-step model deal with surrender. What's interesting, if you have an addiction, one of the things that you try to do as it starts creeping out of control, you start realizing, hey, I might be doing this too much. This might be creeping over into an unhealthy behavior pattern. And so some of you who are aware, you might start thinking, I might not eat that half gallon of cookies and cream ice cream before I go to bed every night. I mean, half of a half gallon's okay. So then you start measuring how much cookies and cream you eat. And so, we figure we can manage our way out of addictions, right? We can think our way out of addictions, correct? I mean, if you're smart, you can think your way out of anything, right? So I know what I'll do. I'll just start buying little things of cookies and cream, and I'll only eat this much cookies and cream. Well, then you buy a bunch of little things of cookies and cream, but then you eat 5 of the little ones. So then you just go back to the half-gallon ones, and then you start, now I'm going to eat, and you can spend years just managing your addiction. And then in the morning you get up and say, oh, crap. Well, I'm going to change that tonight. And so you figure out a new way to manage your addiction. Anybody ever tried to manage some kind of unhealthy addiction? So the best thinking that we have doesn't always get us out of our addiction. I remember when I landed in rehab, the last place on earth I thought I'd ever be. But when I landed in rehab, there's this little statement, your best thinking got you here. I'm like, damn it. I'm smart, I've got degrees, I can think myself out. Don't tell me what I can't think my way out of. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. Anybody ever not be able to think your way out of something? And so what's interesting about this faith, this journey that we're on, and by the way, almost every world religion has this as a cornerstone, is that at some point in our lives, we bump up against our own powerlessness, our own inability to control ourselves or somebody else or a particular situation. We run into our own powerlessness. And sometimes the only solution to that is surrender, letting go. Maybe we call it radical acceptance. Radical acceptance of what is. Something in us we've tried 1,000,000 times to change, and we just finally go, like, my life is powerless and unmanageable. Or there's a person that we can't control, and we've tried 1,000 times, and we finally give up, like, I can't control me, I can't control them. And by the way, I can't even control my circumstances. And sometimes then the only answer to that situation is this sort of radical surrender or letting go, or like accepting reality accepting life on life's terms. And that surrender is not easy. It's not hard, especially if you've got lots of success and lots of education behind you. Well, there's nothing that I'm not able to think my way out of or discipline my way out of, but there is. We all hit our limits. We all bump into these walls where we have to admit, man, I'm not in control. In fact, I can't control it. In fact, it's not healthy for me to even try to control it. I actually need to surrender. I need to make the surrender. And as scary as surrender is, there's freedom in it. When I first started listening to rock and roll, before I got into prog rock in the 70s, I was a huge John Denver fan. And I've had a routine every time I drive to Colorado, I have to listen to at least one John Denver song. And for my young friends that grew up 90s alternative rock and stuff like that, John Denver was way uncool. But I'd still force them to listen to at least one John Denver song if they're in the car on the way to Colorado with me. It's just how it works, isn't that right, Tim? Yeah. And he's a PhD in music, and, he could figure out. But this one is one of my favorites, Sweet Surrender. Lost and alone on some forgotten highway, traveled by many, remembered by few, looking for something that I can believe in, looking for something that I'd like to do with my life. There's nothing behind me, nothing that ties me to something that might have been true yesterday. Tomorrow is open. Right now it seems to be more than enough to just be here today. And I don't know what the future is holding in store. I don't know where I'm going. I'm not sure where I've been. There's a spirit that guides me, a light that shines for me. My life is worth living. I don't need to see the end. Sweet, sweet surrender. Live without care, like a fish in the water, like a bird in the air. Sweet surrender. When we finally figure out that we're not in control, there's a freedom in that surrender. There's a freedom that comes when we actually let go, when we radically accept reality, and when we're willing to get vulnerable and honest about our deepest and darkest secrets. That's the beginning of healing. It's the beginning of freedom from slavery and idolatry, is when we get vulnerable, get real, face our shames, share with some safe people, and give up. Surrender. There's a prayer we pray, I think is a brilliant prayer crafted by a pastor years ago. It's called Serenity Prayer. If you know it, let's say it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Let's pray. Jordan, I'm going to invite you on up. He's going to play a little bit of reflection just for you to think about, well, what is it that I need to let go of? What is it that I need to surrender? Who do I want to surrender to if I don't surrender to me? What's my higher power? Maybe this is a time just to accept reality as it is. Realize what you can't change. And then trust that there's maybe something out there bigger than us that's actually loving and caring. This is, I think, the beginning of freedom. So let's pray. God, come and do a work in our hearts today. And may we be rigorously honest about our shortcomings, about the things that we run to numb ourselves. And help us to find life in the life that we can experience in this moment right now. So I just want to leave this time of reflection as a time for you to meditate about just letting go, radically accepting reality, living life on life's terms, and surrendering to a higher power.